So if you are A1 passionate about what you do, you are going to enjoy the process. If it becomes more of like sort of the mundaneness of life where you have to do a thing because you have to do it, pull the parachute, don't do it. But if you can, if you're constantly passionate about making the best possible podcast, I would say go for it.
So my podcast is called Truth Be Told.
Is Brains Byte back?
Yeah, so I'm currently hosting the Forbes Books podcast.
I run a podcast called I The Bleep.
Well, my show is called History Unplugged.
My name of the show is Everything Everywhere Daily.
So the name of our podcast is Dismantling Dysfunction.
The main podcast I run is called Podcraft.
It's called The Pitch.
So I have two podcasts, Was It Chance? And then the other one is The Brave Files.
I am Denise Griffitts, and the podcast is Your Partner in Success Radio.
My name is Drew, and I make a show called Sleep With Me.
The name of my podcast is Metaphysical AF.
My show is called The Jordan Harbinger Show.
And our podcast is Relearning Leadership.
And you can almost look at it like a tool, because thinking about the name of your podcast, I think it serves two purposes. It's like, what are you focusing on? Like when I started my show in 2013, the idea of a sleep podcast didn't exist, but now at this point, there's tons and tons of sleep podcasts. And so thinking about like what you're titling your show versus titling it your name, I'm thinking like, if you have a big audience, that's great. But if you're just starting out, it's like, what is your show about? Like if you were making a sleep podcast, or if you're talking about something, the more specific you are, and in some sense that people use the word niche or niche, the more you could focus on what you're interested in and what you connect with or what you're skilled at, the better off you are, because that's what the audience is going to connect with. So I think like thinking about your name like that, but also the reality is, and this kind of goes to like, what are you making? Like, are people searching for it? And if they're searching for it, can they find it? And I didn't know that when I started the show. I was just looking for a name that captured the spirit of the show. So I did make it a gigantic list of names, and I was like, oh, how does this feel? No. How does this feel? Like I was looking for something that was a little bit playful and like, oh, this is kind of like PG-13 movie title. Yeah. Like, and so I had found that, but in the end it was like, oh, people are also searching, and your title is going to be one of the things that comes up in the search engine. So the more descriptive it is, so people have a sense of what they're getting into, it's going to be really helpful as well.
Well, I mean, names are a tricky one. It always takes everyone a long time to come up with their names. For me, the clear way to go with a name generally with a podcast is making it as obvious as possible what the podcast is about. The name is often the only thing somebody comes across when they're actually searching for the podcast. They'll be looking through a podcast directory and they'll just have a whole big list of names in front of them. Maybe some artwork as well, but the artwork, what does it have? It just has the podcast name on it. So the podcast name is really often your only place to convince people to listen to your show. So that name has to be really obvious. What is this show about? And what benefit am I going to get from this show? So I like really simple but quite boring names, like the mountain biking show. You know, what's that about? It's about mountain biking. So if you're into mountain biking, you're going to listen to that. Or maybe the the wooden boats show. Oh, I'm into wooden boats, so I'm going to get this. The knitting podcast. They might sound a little bit dull, but it's great actually, because it just explains exactly what the show's about, and lets you, attract listeners to you. I think the worst thing that happens is a lot of people try and get way too clever with their names. They make it quite obscure, and it just means that people don't really know what the show's about, and therefore they just see it and they're like, I'm not sure, and they just go on to the next one. The kind of balance sometimes is you can have a kind of a middle ground, like Podcraft, we like to think is kind of one of these middle grounds. I would say we're actually, don't take this as an example because Podcraft is not a great name from that point of view, but it is about the craft of podcasting. So there is something in there. And what we tend to do is have a tagline on. You can get away with a clever short name that explains it a little bit as long as you have the space for a tagline too. So we often have Podcraft, honing the art of podcasting, and that's the kind of tagline we put along with it. So as long as the name's not too long and you can put in a 5, 6, 7 word tagline, that's when you can kind of explain it more and maybe get away with that kind of slightly cleverer name.
usually you just start with what your niche is. So for me, my niche was spirituality, but there are millions of podcasts. So I thought, how can I kind of differentiate myself and stand out in the crowd of not just being like another podcast about the law of attraction, let's say. So I really liked the word metaphysics and metaphysical, and it really kind of encompassed everything that I was doing. So I did a little bit of research to see if there was anything else that was similar to that. That's the first step, is to make sure that it's unique. So I did a little bit of research. I went on Instagram and TikTok and kind of just searched around to see if there was anything like that. And I didn't see anything like that. So I was like, all right, like I'm going to make it AF, like metaphysical AF, because I don't want to just be put into a box where I only talk about certain parts of spirituality and not others. So I was like, how do I make it an umbrella, but still make it niche for my expertise? And that's where I came up with metaphysical AF.
I don't think you should go with your name. And people, it's funny because I had a guy that I know was like, oh, it's all ego. And I'm like, no, it's just a really sort of lack of insight that you got to be kind of careful with this. The reason my show is called The Jordan Harbinger Show is the chief search for anything having to do with my old company for months and months and months after I left was, where is Jordan Harbinger? Because I just left this really big podcast. And I almost named my show, Where is Jordan Harbinger, thinking I'll change it later. And then I realized, okay, actually through Google search tools, if I just name it The Jordan Harbinger Show, I get like 97% of that search traffic still pointing to me, because people would say like Jordan Harbinger podcast, Jordan Harbinger show. Those are the two top queries, along with like, where is Jordan Harbinger and stuff like that. So I thought, okay, great. I'm going to name my show that. And then when people search for that, there will be one result, and that will be me.
I think it's consistency, and it is all about not waiting for the muse to show up. And this is true for writing. This is true for really any kind of creative project. I would say for people who've been at it for the long haul, that just get started and get going. And you might feel terrible that day. You might feel like you're speaking stupidly. You did a terrible job. But what's funny is when I go back and listen to what I did after the fact, a month later, 6 months later, I can't tell the difference between whether I felt awesome or inspired that day or whether I felt terrible. Sometimes the things that I thought were actually pretty good on the other side of it were the result of days where I didn't feel very good. So once you have consistency and a rhythm, after a while, you really are able to produce pretty well. It's just sort of getting over that initial hump. And it's hard in the beginning. I'm not saying it isn't hard, but I suppose take some comfort in the fact that once you're at it for a while, you're going to get into a pretty good groove. So don't feel bad if you feel ridiculous when you start, or you hate the sound of your own voice. Everyone hates the sound of their own voice and having to listen to their own recording when they get going. I promise you it will get better. So just get over that initial hump and it'll become a lot easier as you go along.
The way I grew my other platforms, like the way I grew an Instagram audience, a Twitter audience, you grow an audience for a platform on the platform. You want to grow an Instagram audience, you do it on Instagram, because 100% of your people are already on Instagram. If you want to grow a podcast audience, you need to do it on podcasts or in podcast players. So we're talking feed drops, ad swaps, paid promotion, buying ads and podcast apps. That's what you have to do. And that's what all the big networks do. That's what Wondery, iHeart, you name it. That's how they grow their shows. And so when I started, I ignored all the podcast gurus and just looked at what do the successful shows do, and then I emulated them at a smaller scale, obviously. But I've been ramping up that scale, and that's how I've been able to continue to grow the show as the show has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger.
So being a part of a network has been the biggest impact to our growth, because just hearing about great shows on other people's shows is just, it makes sense, right? What better audience to advertise your show to than people who already listen to podcasts and are already in the habit of listening, during their commute or whenever they listen. Beyond that, have you heard the term promo swaps? So all of the big networks do this, where basically they say, hey, we're launching a new show and we need to get the word out. We have this many impressions. Let's say it's 10 million impressions across the network. We can help promote another show that you guys are launching, whatever it is, and we'll run it across our back catalog. But we're launching this new show, The Pitch. Can you run this little audio promo? And then they agree to that. We would put together a script, and either their hosts would read it, or more often than not, we would actually record it ourselves. So I would introduce people, say, hey, I'm Josh Muccio, host of The Pitch, where real entrepreneurs pitch to real investors. On this season, we have $10 million invested. Oh, and listeners can actually invest in the companies on our show. So come check it out. Season 9 of The Pitch, wherever you listen to podcasts, right? And then that's going to go across all of these in the ad spots, the available unsold ad inventory. This is all done dynamically using a platform like Megaphone or Art19, something like that, that can insert ads across the back catalog. And, basically you're swapping one for one. Hey, promotions on, impressions on our network versus impressions on yours. But it could be for two separate, completely different shows, but you're just trying to essentially kind of cross promote to different audiences. That is by far the most effective way we've seen to do it. And it's just work.
Powerful.
It's just work to develop those relationships. You kind of have to find other shows of a similar size so that the promo can be, the impressions can be close to 1-to-1. And then they also probably need to be, using dynamic ad insertion so that you can track the impressions and make sure it's kind of a fair swap. So that's a promo swap.
I would say I have found that there are 3 elements which are really important when it comes to developing a successful podcast: high quality, consistency, and adding value. So you need to have those 3 things. And I'll start off first of all with consistency. Most people don't really understand how much it takes to put out a podcast. So often they'll get really hyped up and say, I'm going to do this podcast, and they'll go for it. But most podcasts fade usually after 3 episodes, sometimes 7. So there's a lot of podcasts out there and they don't even make it to double digits because a lot of work goes into it. So before you get started, I definitely say set a realistic timeline of what it's going to take to put out an episode and decide how consistently you're going to do that. It's much better to put out an episode every other week than trying to scramble and put one out every week and you very frequently miss that deadline. So it's better to have a timeline or a deadline that you can meet. So if you're even going to do once a month, that's far better than just like putting them out intermittently, because your listeners are going to want to know when the next episode will be coming out. And also it's important to understand like how much time you have to complete every task that's on your list in order to put an episode out. And that also feeds into high quality. You don't want to be making shortcuts in the process. You don't want to think, oh crap, I don't know, this will do. I'll just have to put something out. You want to make sure that it's high quality, and that means investing in a decent microphone and also making sure that it's edited. Taking out the ums and ahs, filler words usually is a good idea. And ideally, your guest should have good quality audio as well. That's not a necessity. It's more important that you are the one that has good quality, and guests can have mediocre quality. I wouldn't advise it, but it's understandable that sometimes you work with what you got. And then to give value as well. It's not good to have a podcast where you just ramble and you don't really give any value, or you just essentially just waffle on. Really, you want the listener to come away, whatever it is, if they're going to come to learn something, if they're going to come to be entertained, if they're going to come to laugh, whatever it is, you want to make sure that they're getting the value from your podcast so they come back again and again.
I would say, first of all, if you're enjoying podcasting, don't quit, okay? Because the payoff is not instant or immediate unless you already have a huge following who's going to go, oh my gosh, Michael has a podcast, I have to listen to it. You're going to be doing the work from the ground up to let folks know that you're here, what you have to offer, why they want to listen. So engagement is huge. Ask for it. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Give them an email address they can talk to, or follow you on social media. Ask for those reviews because they really do matter. That's one of the ways people find you and they vet you. So don't be shy with any of that, and just know that it's going to take time. But what you can eventually do well is once you have kind of, even if it's small, a solid foundation of listeners, if you can build community with them in any way possible, whether that's some sort of Discord group or Slack group or Facebook group or something, those are great opportunities to build a community. And then the more you do that, the more people want to be part of it.
I can tell you that audiences are looking for high quality content, and they want it to be engaging, informative, and entertaining. They want to feel like they're learning something new or gaining insights into a particular topic or a subject matter. And they're looking for hosts and guests who are knowledgeable, personable, and engaging. And honestly, another thing, well, let me finish my thought. One of the most important factors that audiences resonate with is authenticity. I can't even talk today. They really do want, listeners really do want to feel like they're listening to real people, real stories, and experiences. My kind of attitude and what I've learned is that people don't really want to listen to overly scripted or overly produced content. They want to get to know you. And the other thing is, be consistent. If you say you're going to, I broadcast live Mondays and Fridays. If you say you're going to be there, you darn well better be there. Even if you don't have nothing much to say, show up, because people get used to looking for you at a certain time on certain days. They may not say it, you may not know it, but they're watching.
Growing a podcast is really tough, man. I mean, look, it's always about consistently good quality over a longer period of time, because word of mouth is how podcasts get shared. There's a lot of hubbub about like, oh, you need TikTok clips and you need this and that. And it's, you know, no one has been able to show me any data that TikTok or YouTube converts to podcast listeners. There's a certain amount of it. Look, if you have 15 million subscribers on YouTube when you start a podcast, you're probably going to do okay with your, with your audio podcast. If you don't, and you've got a podcast with 10,000 listeners, starting to go into making TikTok and Instagram and a YouTube and a whatever, they're not necessarily going to feed back into your podcast. I'm not going to say they're a waste of time, but what I am saying is now you're feeding other content machines. You're building a separate audience that's not necessarily going to be monetizable by feeding back into your podcast.
The other thing we're playing with is just platforms, right? The podcast platform is one, which is mostly audio, right? So you have a feed that goes into about 40, 50 different pod systems. There are a lot of markets growing up in those, but about 80% of that comes through Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We are also now we started audio only, and now we're audio video. So we've gone into YouTube and looking at that as an expansion platform. And when we did that, we really doubled our audience. We've got our listening audience, we've got our viewing audience. And that was one interesting thing to us. So it's something we're learning. We'd still love to, get into that next multiple. And we just feel like it's a game of patience and continued content curation.
Okay, folks, that's the thing, right? I need you to know that podcasting is not going to make you a millionaire. Again, you've heard this for the third time now, unless you are already somebody with status, right? You're not going to get sponsorships right away. You're not going to get ad pays right away. Now, one of the ways you can do that is if you get into a group. So I mentioned Was It Chance as part of the Broadway Podcast Network. It's a huge network of podcasts, and we do have ads, and they do monetize to the wildly exciting tune of I get a $12 check about every 3 months, right? This is not a big money-making scheme. One of the things, though, that is awesome that I've done with the Brave Files in particular is it does build brand awareness. So it brings income for me in other ways. It brings people into my sphere, and then they check out what I'm doing. And then when they're looking for a coach or when they want to do something and really change their life and transform, I'm the person that they think of. And so it brings in money that way. So yes, you can get sponsorships, you can have ads, but probably for most of you, it's letting people know how they can find you outside of the podcast and selling them those items.
For people to
You're not going to get sponsors until you have a sufficient audience size. And that's just a reality. If you don't have a lot of people listening, you're just not going to get people wanting to advertise on you, because it's not worth their time to do, 100 shows who get 1,000 downloads when you can get one show that has 100,000.
Right.
So what I did for the first 18 months I did my show is I ran affiliate ads. I just signed up for the affiliate accounts for audible.com and a host of other products that fit with my show. And then I created my own ads for them and I put them in. So episode 1 of my show had ads, and people were always accustomed to ads in every single show. And I didn't really care about the amount of money I made. I didn't really make much off of it. But what I did is I just took those first 18 months and I focused entirely on growth. That's all I worried about. Any dollar I made, I plowed it back in to show promotion to keep growing the show. And there's a couple different ways you could do it. You can have a baked in ad, which means that it's permanently on the show and it's there forever. Or you can do dynamic ad insertion, in which case it doesn't really matter. They're just buying a number of impressions and they're constantly changing. So even on old shows, they can show new ads on them if people go to your back catalog. And most large networks are doing things on a dynamic basis now.
Your primary area of monetization could be different. There's some shows make a lot of money from live performances. Some shows make a lot of money from sponsorships, and some do crowdfunding, some do merch. And one of those is going to end up being your primary source if you do the show for a while. And you don't, my advice or my experience is you want to keep focusing on growing the show as much as possible. And honestly, and this is going to be hard to believe, and I would not have believed it. If I was listening to the show and listening to the two of us talk in the first 2 or 3 years of my show, I'd have been like, that guy does not know what he's talking about. So if you don't believe me, I totally get it. But your show will really kind of show you which of those pools is best to start monetizing first, because your audience is going to let you know. And as soon as you've heard it 10 times, it'll be like, hey, why don't you do a live show? Hey, why don't you have merch? Whatever the first thing is that you hear from 10 listeners, that should be your first try at monetization. But that's already after you've heard from tons of people hey, I love spreading the word about the show. I love telling my cousins about your show. Or I love, sharing your show with people. And so that could be something like Patreon. It could be sponsorships, or it could be one of those other things. But it usually is something that just becomes apparent. My show is not successful with merch or live performances. Those aren't things that work with my show. They are things I do, but they don't really bring in any revenue. And sponsorship's been something that's been slower with my show of trying to find the right partners. So for me, it was listeners were like, hey, how come you don't have something like Patreon? And I was like, oh, okay, let me look into this. And then I learned more about it. And even that was something that when we started it just slowly kind of grew along with the podcast.
Look, if you somehow end up with millions of views per day on TikTok, the conversion might happen where people start to look for your podcast. That might be a thing. But most of us can't rely on that kind of algorithm to just take over and help us grow like wildfire. It's just highly unlikely. So what's most likely to happen is you're going to grow your show slowly by doing something really good that gets people sharing it, and you're going to end up with a snowball effect because you're retaining people.
I think when we first started, and we've been, like most people who finally do it, we've been thinking about it and talking about it for quite a while. And part of the challenge was we have so many different areas of expertise, and there's, lots of podcasts that are out there, and you sort of start to look around and see what else people are talking about. So I think we had a little bit of a challenge of trying to come down to that. What is the one thing, or the sort of what we want to go out to the world and really talk about that is unique to us and has longevity? So as Anne said, it's we ended up talking about dysfunction because it's something that a lot of people, or very few people, talk about. It's one of those things that's sort of that dark little secret that people will talk about, the sort of the elephant of the room, and sort of walk around it but ignore it. But I think because we ended up there because of what Anne was saying, that ability to bring it out into so many different places and spaces, that we weren't going to be too narrowly defined, and we weren't necessarily going to be doing direct competition with other folks. There's, a lot of the work that we do is in the leadership space, is in the personal development space. There are a lot of podcasts out there. And so I think that's probably what took us the longest, was to, come out and what's our unique angle that's really unique to us. And we'd often joke worked with people over the last few decades that were dysfunction experts. And so when we were working on it, say, hey, why don't we go with that? Why don't we lead with that? And so there's a little bit of a leap too when we sort of try and define a space from a podcast perspective that you're going to uniquely own.
I will say, and I say this to everyone who's starting a podcast, I will say the guest booking process, and I'm sure if you talk to 50 podcasters, unless they are Joe Rogan or Dax Shepard, at the end of the day, the toughest thing is getting those guests. And I don't necessarily mean by acquiring big name guests, but just the amount of work and time that it takes to wrangle schedules around people's availability, your availability, the guest's availability. That would, I say, for anyone who's getting into it, it's important to two things, and it's actually with the same word, expectations for yourself and expectations for your audience. If you're doing this as a side hustle or a hobby and hope to grow it into a profession, you almost have to act as if it is a profession. So what kind of expectations do you have of yourself to do this? Are you able to only record 10 podcasts in the course of a year? If that's the case, make seasons. So say, hey, listen, to yourself, I only have bandwidth to do 10 podcasts. Okay, put together a schedule where you put out 10 weekly episodes, and that's your first season. Then you take a break, take time to refuel, reimagine the podcast, develop a schedule during that little hiatus, and then boom, I've got time for season 2 where I will record 10 more, and then think of it that way. I think if people do that, they deliver their own expectations, but then they deliver the expectations of the audience, because the audience will know, okay, cool. Michael's got a podcast. He's got a 10 episode season. I'm going to check it out. After episode 10, he's going to take a break. And then all of a sudden, oh, he's coming back in the spring with a new season. Boom, 10 more episodes. So expectations for yourself and for your audience are key. And I'm sure you're going to come up, Michael, when you speak to folks about launching a podcast, you'll hear the dreaded pod fade. And the pod fade is essentially when you listen to a podcast and it's on for a few weeks, few months, and then all of a sudden it stops for no apparent reason, no announcements, no season finale, show finale. The show just ends because either the person stopped doing it for whatever reason, personal or professionally, or they just got tired of doing it. And it happens all the time. So when you hear these epic numbers of the gazillion of podcasts that are available, you have to really think about the active podcast. So to remain active, you've got to give yourself grace, give yourself those expectations to know what you're able to do. Because I think that's super important, because once you internalize it, then you can externalize it. Once you internalize yourself, I'm like, okay, cool. This is all the bandwidth I have to do. And then the audience has expectations as to what you are going to deliver. And I think that is the first thing anyone should consider when doing a podcast, because you don't want to think of it as like, okay, I'm going to do a weekly podcast, period, full stop. Don't think like that, because unless you're independently wealthy and have all the free time in the world, there's no way on God's green earth that you are going to be able to do a weekly podcast every single week with the same level of enthusiasm, production value, if you don't have these barriers set in place for yourself. Because after a while, what'll happen is the dreaded pod fade, where you're like, I just can't get to this week's episode. Oh, I'll wait another week. Okay, 2 weeks, I'll wait another week. And then all of a sudden, it's gone.
Don't overthink it. Get out of your own way, and don't let imposter syndrome knock you into the wall. Just do it. Meet with people if you're going to do an interview type of podcast, which I happen to love. Talk with people that you really admire, that you like what they're doing. It may not be your thing at all, but you get to learn something from them. If you're going to do, it's just you talking, make sure that you're interesting. Speak about things that you're very passionate about, that you have some knowledge about, and you just do whatever that you're going to do best. But honestly, don't get in your own way. If you overthink it, you're dead in the water.
A lot of people will take 1 or 2 years, and then they're like, why did I wait so long? I think find your passion. It's the old saying, it's like a job. If you love what you do, it's not work. It's same with the podcast. If you love what you're talking about, it's not, because this is, as you know, it's work.
Yeah.
Work. I actually now have a team of people helping, interns and assistant helping me put a program together where for years I was doing everything myself, promotion, distribution, booking. So it takes time, but yeah, the biggest thing is just find your passion and just do it.
Yeah.
And spread the word to your friends and families first. They're probably the least people that will watch and listen. My mom and dad probably out of all those probably has listened to one.
Yeah.
It's okay, but it's just really building that relationship with people on your social medias, and just keep going. You can't expect. I think social media has not ruined it, but just kind of put a false impression that you should be famous or you should be successful. I have 4 podcasts, and how come I only have 5 downloads? Well, it took me about 1.5 years to really grasp a hold of an audience.
Right.
But in the top 5% in podcasts worldwide. So
amazing. Yeah. Stay consistent. Love the message.
Consistent. Yeah. Even taking breaks. I know it's hard, but even taking breaks. If you need to take a break, pre-record 4 or 5 in a row and play them for a month, and then come back and do it. It's consistency, because people will forget very quickly.
It's a tricky one because
there's so many... a single one. You're right.
Yeah, no, no, but the reason is it's not that. I think it's like, who is this podcaster? Are they doing it as a side hustle? Are they doing it for fun? Are they doing it to be a profession one day? Yeah. I will say, if you're any one of those 3 people, you have to have a passion for it. So if you love doing it, it's just like anything else. If you love doing what you're doing, you will succeed in your own way. And I'm not talking about succeeding 100,000 downloads, making $500,000. I'm talking about succeeding in being proud of the product that you put out. So if you are passionate about what you do, you are going to enjoy the process. If it becomes more of like, oh God, I gotta skate. Once you get into this, like, sort of the mundaneness of life where you have to do a thing because you have to do it, pull the parachute, don't do it. But if you can, if you're constantly passionate about making the best possible podcast, I would say go for it. But I think first that passion thing is so important, because if you're not passionate about it, I wouldn't waste your time doing it, because it really,
a lot of work,
it's a lot of work. And it's also respectful of people's time. Like, especially if you're doing in this case, I'm talking about interview style podcast. If you're doing interview style podcast and you're not passionate about it, you're taking someone else's time from their day to do a podcast. So I'm always super respectful about other people. And I'm always honored when people want to be on my podcast or any of the podcasts I'm producing, because it's like, that's the one thing we can't buy, Michael. We can buy all the shit in the world. We can buy cars, boats, houses. You can't buy time. And so if the time is valuable to you, you sure as hell better make sure it's valuable enough for those people that are involved in your podcast.
Just try it. Don't do all the research. Be like, oh yeah, like this person on this podcast said to do it this way, and this person said it this way, and I'm going to sit and toil for hours and hours to like come up with the perfect plan. You don't know until you try. Try first, make little adjustments, and that's the best place to start. Make sure you have even a cheap microphone. Even the Apple headphones can often be pretty good. There are so many like cheap ways to get into it. There's great tools like Buzzsprout for distribution. You don't have to like go to each individual place, and it's super cheap, $10, $12 a month to sort of access that. And yeah, just try it. You don't know until you try. Give it a go and then tweak from there. Take that episode, send it out to 5 or 6 of your friends, and get their honest feedback.
Just do it. Don't overthink it. Don't take so much advice that you're just blind, that you have no idea where to start. Figure out what you really want to do, how you really want to present, how you want to show up in the world, and honestly be a servant leader to the world, because that's what we do. And I'm not talking in a religious sense at all. I'm just giving as much information to people as I can, but do what feels right to you. If somebody's saying, oh, you got to do an interview thing and you don't want to, don't do that. Do what feels right to you, and it will eventually coalesce and you'll have it. It'll just pop into your head one day and you go, okay, I've got it.
So what I'm finding is that over preparing is bad, because then you get locked into a design you're thinking should happen, and then it feels a bit forced. Under preparing is bad. You don't think about some of the creative questions, or they come out a little bit ad hoc and it doesn't flow real well. It's a real trick to identify some key questions that drive a conversation, but then being dynamic in the moment to allow that humanness to come through, and the emotion and the fun and the banter and, you know, all those things that make, I think, a podcast, especially an interview-based podcast.
Your guest is not your friend. They are your partner. The person you care about is your audience. So when I have a pretty good rapport with guests when they're on the show, but I'm really not there to suck up to them. And if they tell a story that really isn't valuable to my audience, or they're flattering their own ego, I'm just going to cut that out. And they've never come back to me, but if they come back to me and say, hey, why'd you cut out my story? That's my favorite story. Well, I'm glad you like that story, but I don't think that story is in my audience's interest, because the number one person I'm there for is my audience. So yeah, I'm not there to suck up to my guests. My guests are awesome. I love my guests, but at the end of the day, it's about serving my audience. That's what I really care about.